There's a certain kind of man the world depends on. The kind who shows up before you even finish asking. The kind who drives through a storm at midnight because someone called crying. The kind who walks into situations most people would run from, not because he doesn't feel fear, but because somewhere deep inside him, turning away feels like dying. His name was Daniel Cole. And the night he almost didn't come home, the people who loved him most finally understood something they should have seen years ago. He wasn't saving others because he was brave. He was saving others because he didn't know how to save himself. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why did Daniel Cole always feel responsible for everyone around him? Why couldn't he say no, even when saying yes was destroying everything he loved? And what was it, buried deep in his childhood, that kept driving him back into danger, again and again, long after any reasonable person would have walked away? These are the questions that sit at the center of this story. But the most important question of all is this: when does helping others stop being a virtue, and start becoming a form of self-destruction? Stay with us. Because the answer to that question is going to take us somewhere most people never expect. Daniel grew up in a small town called Millhaven, Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and nobody asks too many questions. His father, Raymond, was a man who worked hard during the day and drank harder at night. His mother, Carol, was a gentle woman who had learned to make herself invisible when Raymond's mood shifted. Daniel was the oldest of 2 children. His younger sister, Amy, was 7 years older in wisdom than she was in years, because growing up in that house had a way of aging a child fast. Most nights were fine. But on the nights they weren't, the whole house seemed to hold its breath. Daniel would lie in his bed listening for footsteps, for raised voices, for the sound of a glass being knocked off the kitchen counter. And when things got bad, he would go to Amy's room, sit beside her, and say the only thing he knew how to say: "I've got you." He was 10 years old. And that sentence became the sentence that defined the rest of his life. Think about that for a second. A 10-year-old boy, in the dark, telling his little sister he's got her, as if he had any power to stop what was happening. But here's the thing about children who grow up in chaos: they don't choose to become protectors. They're forced into it. And once that role gets burned into your identity, you carry it everywhere you go, into your friendships, your marriage, your career, your decisions. You carry it until it nearly kills you. That's exactly what happened to Daniel Cole. By the time he was 15, Daniel was doing things no teenager should have to do. He was paying electric bills with money he made mowing lawns. He was cooking dinner because his mother was too exhausted to stand up. He was the one who drove Amy to school, even before he had a license, because Raymond had crashed the car the previous winter and nobody had fixed it since. His teachers noticed. One of them, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, pulled him aside once after class and asked him quietly, "Daniel, is everything okay at home?" He smiled at her. That easy, disarming smile that people would come to know so well. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Everything's fine." He walked out of that classroom and never spoke about it again. He had already decided, without being fully aware of it, that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people: those who needed saving, and those who did the saving. And he knew exactly which one he was going to be. Daniel graduated high school, earned a partial scholarship to a state university, and studied fire science, which surprised nobody who grew up with him. He became a firefighter at 22, got married at 26 to a woman named Laura, who was warm, patient, sharp-eyed, and absolutely certain, from the very beginning, that she had fallen in love with someone who was also his own worst enemy. Laura saw it clearly. She saw how he volunteered for every extra shift. She saw how he'd come home exhausted and still walk next door to help the elderly couple down the street carry groceries. She saw how his phone was always full of messages from people asking for things, and how he answered every single one. "You can't carry the whole world, Daniel," she told him one evening, while he was eating dinner standing up because he was already halfway out the door to go help someone. He looked at her. He smiled. "Someone has to." She didn't argue. She'd learned by then that arguing with Daniel about this was like trying to stop a river with your hands. They had a daughter together. Her name was Mia, and she had Daniel's dark eyes and Laura's stubborn streak. Mia adored her father. She loved the way he smelled like the outdoors and old coffee. She loved how he'd sit on the porch with her in the evenings and tell her stories about calls he'd gone on, always the funny ones, never the hard ones. She didn't know yet, at age 8, that her father came home from some shifts and sat in his truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before coming inside, because he needed that time to put all the bad things somewhere they wouldn't touch her. He carried those things quietly. Privately. The way he carried everything, without complaint, without burdening anyone, because that was the deal he'd made with himself a long, long time ago. By his mid-30s, Daniel had built a reputation in Millhaven that bordered on legend. People told stories about him the way small towns tell stories, half fact, half folklore. There was the time he pulled a woman out of a car that had gone into Miller's Creek during a flash flood. There was the time he talked a teenager down off the water tower on a Tuesday night while the rest of the town slept. There was the afternoon he ran into a garage fire to drag out a man's dog, not because it was protocol, but because he heard it barking and couldn't leave it. His captain told him afterward, with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion, one day, "Cole, you're gonna do something like that and it's gonna cost you everything." Daniel nodded. He understood. But understanding something and changing your behavior because of it are two completely different things. He kept going. Then, in the fall of his 37th year, a man named Marcus Webb walked back into his life. Marcus and Daniel had grown up 2 streets apart. They'd played baseball together as kids, drifted apart in high school, and lost touch completely after college. Marcus had always been charming and a little reckless, the kind of guy who made poor decisions with a smile on his face and then called someone else to clean up the mess. Daniel had always known this about him. And he'd always liked him anyway, in the way you sometimes like people who remind you of what your life could have looked like if you'd made different choices. One Thursday evening in October, Marcus showed up at Daniel's front door. It was raining. He was wearing a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the weather and shoes that had seen better days. When Daniel opened the door and saw him standing there, something in Marcus's face stopped him cold. He had the look of a man who had run out of options. Marcus came inside. Laura made coffee. And then Marcus started talking. The short version was this: he had borrowed money from a man named Garrett, not a bank, not a credit union, but a man, and the debt had grown in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated, and now Garrett and the people around him were making threats that didn't sound like empty ones. He owed somewhere around $8,000. He'd been trying to piece it together. He'd almost had it. But then something happened, he was vague about what, and now the number had jumped to 15, and Garrett was not a patient man. Marcus looked at Daniel across the kitchen table and said, "You're the only person I trust, man. I just need someone to help me figure this out." Laura stood by the counter with her coffee mug and said nothing. But when Marcus excused himself to use the bathroom, she turned to Daniel and said, very quietly, "This is not your problem." Daniel looked at her. He looked at the table. He looked at the rain running down the kitchen window. And somewhere in the back of his mind, an image surfaced that he hadn't thought about in years: young Amy, 7 years old, sitting on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide and frightened, while voices raged in the hall outside. He cleared his throat. "I'll just talk to him," he said. "Figure out what he actually needs. That's all. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever been in a situation like this? Where someone came to you with a problem that wasn't yours, and you felt that pull, that almost physical pull, to step in? Where saying no felt impossible, not because you were weak, but because something deep inside you was convinced that you were the only thing standing between that person and disaster? If you felt that, then you already understand Daniel better than he understood himself. What happened over the next 3 weeks is where the story shifts from difficult to dangerous. Daniel agreed to meet with Garrett, not to pay the money, but to negotiate. He convinced himself he could reason with the man. He'd talked people down from ledges before. He'd walked into burning buildings. A conversation with some local tough in a parking lot, how bad could it be? Laura told him not to go. She said it calmly, without tears, which was somehow more frightening than if she'd yelled. "I'm asking you not to do this," she said. He kissed her on the forehead. He went anyway. The meeting was in a parking lot behind an auto body shop on the east side of town, 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Daniel drove there alone. He sat in his truck for a moment before getting out, feeling the cold air come in through the cracked window, hearing the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the road. He thought, briefly, about turning around. Then he got out of the truck. The conversation started relatively calmly. Garrett was younger than Daniel expected, maybe 30, with a flat expression and the kind of stillness that made you uncomfortable. There were 2 other men with him, standing slightly back, hands in their pockets. Daniel explained that Marcus was going to pay. He explained that the timeline needed to be realistic. He kept his voice level and his posture open, everything his years of experience had taught him about de-escalating a tense situation. For about 4 minutes, it seemed like it might actually work. And then Garrett said the number had gone up again. 20,000 now. For his trouble. And something in Daniel's jaw tightened. He said no. He said 15 was already unreasonable. He said he wasn't leaving until they agreed to something fair. One of the men in the back shifted his weight. Garrett's expression didn't change. "You sure you want to do this?" he said. Daniel said yes. There was a silence that felt very long. Then Garrett nodded slowly, and said, "All right then." And then one of the men behind him took a step forward, and the situation moved faster than Daniel could process, and before it was over, he was on the ground in the rain with pain spreading across the left side of his head and the sound of tires on wet asphalt getting further and further away. A woman driving home from a late hospital shift found him 20 minutes later. She called 911. By the time the ambulance arrived, Daniel was barely conscious. He had a severe concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a deep laceration above his left eye that would leave a scar he'd carry for the rest of his life. Laura got the call at 12:43 in the morning. Mia was asleep down the hall. Laura sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her hand for a long moment after she hung up, and then she went to the closet to get her coat, and she was crying by the time she found it, not in the way people cry in movies, but in that quiet, terrible way that happens when you've been holding something for a very long time and you simply can't hold it anymore. If this story has your heart heavy right now, drop a comment and tell us, what would you have done if you were Laura? Would you have stayed? Would you have walked away? And if you were Daniel, lying on that pavement in the rain, knowing the person you went there for was already gone, what would be going through your mind? Let us know below. We read every single comment. Daniel spent 3 days in the hospital. For the first 2, he mostly slept. On the third day, he was awake enough to have real conversations, and that was when Laura came in and sat down beside his bed and looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. She didn't say, "I told you so." She wasn't that kind of woman. What she said was, "You almost didn't come home, Daniel." And then she said something he wasn't expecting, "And Marcus is gone. He left town 2 days ago. He didn't even call." The room was very quiet after that. The machines beeped softly. Outside the window, the sky was the pale, washed-out gray of a Midwest morning after rain. Here's where the story takes a turn that Daniel himself said he didn't see coming, even though, looking back, he probably should have. A therapist named Dr. Elaine Marsh had been brought in as part of the hospital's trauma support program. She stopped by on the afternoon of his second full day of consciousness, and they talked, not about the incident, at first, but about his work as a firefighter, his family, his life. She was a quiet, attentive woman with the kind of face that made you feel like you could say anything and it would land somewhere safe. At some point in their second session, she asked him a question that he later described as hitting him like a physical blow. "Daniel, when you drove to that parking lot that night, who were you really trying to save?" He opened his mouth to answer. And then he stopped. Because the honest answer wasn't Marcus. He realized that in the silence of that hospital room, with Elaine watching him without judgment, it wasn't Marcus. It was never Marcus. It was a 10-year-old boy in a hallway in Millhaven, Ohio, who had believed that if he could just be strong enough, brave enough, present enough, no one else would ever have to be afraid. He cried in that session. Not theatrically. Just the way a man cries when something that has been locked up for 27 years finally gets a door opened in front of it. He sat in that hospital bed with his cracked ribs and his stitched-up eye and he cried, and Elaine sat with him, and the afternoon light came through the window and fell across the floor, and it was, he said later, the first time in as long as he could remember that he didn't feel like he needed to hold himself together. How does that land with you? Because here's the thing this story asks us to sit with: how many of us are running on a decision we made as children, without ever realizing it? How many of us chose a role back then, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the strong one, and have been playing it ever since, calling it strength, when really it's just a wound that never got treated? If that question hits close to home, you are not alone. And neither was Daniel. The recovery took months. Physically, Daniel was mostly back to himself by January. But the deeper work, the therapy sessions, the conversations with Laura that sometimes went until 2 in the morning, the slow and uncomfortable process of learning to recognize the difference between genuine care for others and compulsive self-erasure, that work took much longer. He took a leave of absence from the fire department. He stopped coaching Little League, just for a season. He told people no, and the first few times he did it, his hands actually shook afterward, because every part of his nervous system was convinced that saying no made him dangerous, made him negligent, made him the thing he had feared his whole life, someone who doesn't show up. But the world kept turning. Nobody collapsed. Nobody needed to be rescued because Daniel Cole took a night off. One evening in late February, about 4 months after the hospital, Daniel was sitting on the porch when his neighbor called over the fence and asked if Daniel could help him move a couch on Saturday morning. The old instinct rose up immediately: of course, no problem, what time? He felt it clearly now. He could feel the reflex. And he paused. Just a beat. He thought about the plans he and Laura had made for Saturday. He thought about Mia, who had asked him twice already that week if they could go to the park. He thought about what Elaine had said about the difference between generosity and self-abandonment. Then he looked at his neighbor and said, "I've got something going Saturday, but my buddy Kevin has a truck and he's usually free on weekends. Want me to give you his number? His neighbor said that would be great. That was the whole conversation. Daniel went back inside, and Laura was standing in the kitchen, and she looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, like a light behind her eyes had brightened slightly. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I actually am." The investigation into the parking lot incident resulted in Garrett and one of the other men being charged and eventually convicted on assault charges. 6 months after Daniel's release from the hospital, justice caught up with the men who had put him on that pavement. Marcus Webb never returned to Millhaven. Daniel heard through the grapevine, about a year later, that Marcus was living somewhere in the Southwest, that he was doing okay. He didn't reach out. He thought about it, once or twice. And then he decided that was okay too, that some chapters end, and you don't have to write an epilogue for every one of them. Daniel went back to work the following spring. His captain welcomed him back without a lot of fanfare, which was exactly how Daniel wanted it. He still cared. He was still good at his job, still the person you wanted beside you when things got bad. But something had shifted in how he operated. He started talking to younger firefighters about stress and trauma in ways he never had before. He started recognizing when a crew member was running on fumes and sending them home. He became, paradoxically, more effective at saving people, because he was no longer trying to save himself in the process. Laura said it best, on an evening about 8 months after everything happened, sitting in the backyard while Mia chased fireflies in the grass. She and Daniel were quiet for a while, just watching. Then she said, "You know what I love most about you right now?" He shook his head. She looked at him. "You're finally here," she said. "Like, actually here. Not already halfway out the door." He held her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. So let's sit with the question this story asks all of us: is there someone in your life you keep trying to save, even when they haven't asked to be saved? Is there a version of help you offer that is really just a way of keeping yourself from having to sit with your own pain? And if the thing that happened to Daniel happened to you, if you found yourself lying on cold asphalt in the rain, hurting, for someone who was already gone, what would it take for you to finally let yourself be the one who needs saving? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to hear your story too. There is no shame in being strong. Strength is a gift. But unchecked, unexamined strength, strength that refuses to rest, that doesn't know how to receive, that confuses being needed with being loved, that kind of strength is also a wound wearing a cape. Daniel Cole learned that the hard way. And in learning it, he became something more than a hero. He became, finally, a whole person. That's worth more than every rescue he ever ran. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your life, or maybe even yourself, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for the people we love is hand them a mirror. Subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain. They awaken something inside you.